We're going to explore a topic today that is, well, it's a truly profound and devastating case study in institutional failure.
It really is.
This is an exploration of how the very systems designed to protect us, medicine, forensic science, and the law, can all align in a spectacular error.
And lead to just the most tragic of outcomes. In this case, the wrongful conviction of a mother.
A mother whose only crime, as it turned out, was having a child suffering from a rare, undiagnosed genetic disorder.
Our entire analysis today is going to focus on the documented sequence of events in the case of Patricia Stallings.
And understanding that sequence is just so vital.
It's absolutely vital for you, the listener, because this story isn't just about a single mistake. It's about how something like confirmation bias can just harden scientific and legal opinions into something unbreakable.
Yeah, into a wall.
Exactly. Our mission here is to trace, step by step, how a life-threatening but entirely natural genetic condition was fundamentally misdiagnosed and then prosecuted as a malicious criminal act.
An act of poisoning.
An act of poisoning. And it ultimately cost a young mother nearly 2 years of her life and, tragically, cost the life of her infant son. We want to understand the forensic and legal mechanisms that allowed this injustice to happen.
Let's start with the background, just to establish the human context here.
Okay.
Patricia Stallings was born around 1964-65. She was a young woman living a pretty typical life in Jefferson County, Missouri.
Great.
She met David Stallings while working at a convenience store, and they got married in 1988.
And then their first son, Ryan, was born in April of 1989.
So you have this portrait of a new, optimistic family unit.
A young family just starting out.
And that's right before the tragedy struck.
And the source material shows just how swiftly this all happened, how a medical crisis almost instantly became a legal one.
So in early July of 1989, Ryan, who was just a few months old at this point, became acutely ill. Patricia took him to Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital because he was suffering from these really severe symptoms, intense vomiting and significant difficulty breathing.
These are classic signs of a child in metabolic distress. So he was admitted immediately to the pediatric intensive care unit.
And this is the exact moment. This is where the catastrophic misinterpretation began.
It happens right at the start.
As the medical team rushed to stabilize Ryan, they noted a very high level of a substance in his blood.
Right.
And through their initial testing, the physicians believed this substance to be ethylene glycol.
And that's the critical link. That's the turning point.
Why is that specific substance so important?
Well, ethylene glycol is the main ingredient in antifreeze. It's a known, potent, and purely exogenous toxin.
Exogenous meaning?
Meaning it does not naturally occur in the human body through metabolism. It has to come from the outside.
So if you find high levels of it in an infant,
the immediate and frankly logical conclusion for a hospital and for law enforcement is poisoning, and often criminal intent. The interpretation was instantaneous and dire. Antifreeze poisoning was suspected.
The speed of the institutional reaction when you look at the timeline, it's genuinely shocking.
It is.
Because of this initial toxicology report, the medical diagnosis translated immediately into a legal action.
That's right. The infant, Ryan, was placed in protective custody,
separating him from his mother based solely on that single initial test result.
This separation happened very quickly. Patricia Stallings was eventually permitted a short, supervised visit with Ryan. That was on August 31st.
And tragically, just 4 days after that visit, Ryan's severe illness came back. It recurred.
And for the authorities, you can see how that would look.
It's the confirmation.
It seemed to confirm the entire poisoning narrative. It looked like the mother had another opportunity and, well, that she acted on it again.
That recurrence sealed her fate, or at least the official perception of her fate.
It did.
On September 5th, 1989, Stallings was arrested on assault charges, all related to the suspected poisoning.
And Ryan died just 2 days later, on September 7th. He was still being treated for what the hospital believed was antifreeze ingestion.
Once Ryan died, the charges against his mother were immediately escalated to first-degree murder.
Just think about the emotional and legal trajectory you just laid out.
It's unbelievable.
From a desperate mother seeking medical help for her sick child in early July to facing a life sentence for murder in early September.
All based on an initial toxicology report that pointed to a toxin.
It really demonstrates this immediate and profound reliance on that first medical reading. the system, once it was alerted to potential criminality, it
Mm.
it defaulted to the poisoning hypothesis and stopped looking for anything else.
Any alternative natural explanations were just off the table?
Completely off the table.
Yeah.
The failure of the medical establishment to question the specificity of its own testing, that became the failure of the justice system to reserve judgment.
It's just heartbreaking to consider the terror she must have experienced. Watching her child suffer, being separated from him, and then facing the charge of killing him.
All within a span of just 9 weeks.
An absolute nightmare. Okay, let's unpack the next phase of this case, which is where the systemic failure, it really just doubles down.
This is the legal blockade.
Yes, the legal blockade that actively prevented crucial scientific exculpatory evidence from ever being presented during her trial.
This is the turning point that really shows the rigidity of the justice system once a narrative takes hold.
So, while Patricia Stallings was incarcerated, awaiting her trial, a key event occurred.
An event that should have fundamentally shattered the prosecution's entire theory.
But they resisted it.
They actively resisted its implications.
Yeah.
She gave birth to her second son, David Jr., or DJ. That was on February 17th, 1990.
And naturally, David Jr. was placed in foster care almost immediately after his birth.
Of course, his mother was facing capital charges.
What happened next should have been impossible under the prosecution's poisoning theory.
Completely impossible. Just weeks after his birth, in March, David Jr. developed symptoms that were strikingly similar, if not identical, to those that had afflicted Ryan.
Severe vomiting, listlessness, signs of metabolic distress.
All of it. And this was despite having absolutely zero contact with his mother, who was incarcerated.
So this parallel case provided a stunning natural experiment.
It demanded a full, definitive medical investigation, and this time the physicians found the correct answer.
And the diagnosis for David Jr. was confirmed as?
Methylmalonic acidemia, or MMA.
And what exactly is that?
Our source material confirms this is a rare, inherited genetic condition that impacts metabolism. In simple terms, the body lacks an enzyme it needs to properly process certain proteins and fats.
And that causes a dangerous buildup of something.
Oh, propionic acid.
And this acid buildup is what leads directly to those life-threatening symptoms, right?
Yeah.
The vomiting, the lethargy, the difficulty breathing.
Exactly. It causes severe metabolic acidosis. The body is essentially poisoning itself from within.
So David Jr., once he was diagnosed, was put on a special diet and treatment.
That's right. He recovered and was returned to foster care.
Now, this diagnosis, it should have immediately introduced reasonable doubt into Ryan's murder case.
It should have stopped everything. It proposed that his death was natural, that it was genetic.
You would assume that, ethically and legally, the prosecution would be compelled to review Ryan's case in light of this. I mean, this is definitive exculpatory evidence from a full sibling.
But the source material indicates the complete opposite. Prosecutors initially refused to believe the sibling's MMA diagnosis was relevant to Ryan's case.
Why? Why the resistance? Was this just an oversight or a deliberate refusal to admit they were wrong?
It really speaks to a deep-seated confirmation bias. I mean, when you have successfully convinced yourself, the media and the court, that you have deliberate poisoning on your hands.
It's incredibly difficult to back down.
It's incredibly difficult to admit that your foundational evidence was wrong. Changing the narrative means admitting that the entire process, the arrest, the murder charge, the incarceration, was a catastrophic error, so they dug in.
And what makes this so damning is the documented evidence revealing the prosecution actually knew that MMA was a possibility all along.
Precisely. In May of 1990, Stallings' defense attorney, Eric Rathbone, he obtained notes from the assistant prosecutor, John S. Applebaum.
And what did those notes say?
These notes confirm that the doctor who pronounced Ryan dead had considered the possibility of an MMA diagnosis during Ryan's initial hospitalization.
So they thought of it.
They did, but they never followed through with the specific testing required to confirm or rule it out. They became so focused on that antifreeze reading instead.
So they had an internal confirmation, a note, that a medical professional had flagged this exact possibility.
Yes.
Yet they chose to ignore the clear evidence from the second child. What was their legal loophole? How did they justify that?
Their official stance became convoluted. They argued that even if Ryan had suffered from MMA, he had also been poisoned by ethylene glycol.
So both.
Both. They maintained there were important differences between ethylene glycol and a related substance, propylene glycol, essentially trying to argue that the presence of the genetic disorder didn't rule out a concurrent criminal poisoning.
That's a classic legal maneuver, isn't it? To sustain the charge and just sideline the inconvenient evidence.
It is. It's an immense failure of ethical responsibility. They were required to uphold justice, yet they were actively working to suppress information that pointed directly toward innocence.
And this injustice, it really crystallized during the trial itself.
It did. The defense lawyer, Rathbone, he pushed hard to introduce the MMA theory based on David Jr.'s definitive diagnosis. But the lead prosecutor, George B. McElroy, he deemed the siblings' diagnosis irrelevant.
Irrelevant? How?
Who argued it was too speculative regarding Ryan himself.
And the judge in the case, Gary Kramer, he sided with the prosecution on this crucial point. Now, hold on. Is that common legal practice? To dismiss genetic evidence from a full sibling just because the deceased wasn't tested before they died?
It's an immense example of legal rigidity. It borders on negligence.
So Judge Kramer forbade the defense from even advancing the MMA theory.
That's right, because technically there was no specific laboratory evidence showing Ryan himself had been affected by it. They demanded direct, pre-death proof of MMA in Ryan.
Even though the doctors had failed to perform those tests in the first place.
Exactly, and the genetic link through the family's medical history was crystal clear. The court essentially prioritized the incomplete initial toxicology report over subsequent, definitive, exculpatory medical fact from the same family line.
And because the court prevented this critical evidence, the diagnosis of David Jr. from being considered by the jury.
The jury was left with only one story.
The initial toxicology report suggesting antifreeze poisoning.
That was it.
So Patricia Stallings was convicted of first-degree murder on January 31st, 1991, and she was sentenced to life in prison.
Wrongly incarcerated, based on a flaw in scientific methodology that the court refused to even acknowledge.
It is truly astonishing that the entire formal legal appeals process failed her, and that the eventual correction came not from a higher court, but from a television program.
That's right.
This moves us into the second part. The scientific intervention that finally dismantled the prosecution's entire flawed case.
The legal avenues, choked by that procedural rigidity we just talked about, had failed her. It was public awareness that finally opened the door for real scientific scrutiny.
And the case was featured on the popular true crime television program Unsolved Mysteries in May of 1991.
And the source material is unequivocal about this. That broadcast was the direct catalyst for the intervention that followed.
So the entire formal legal system failed, and the scientific breakthrough literally came from a late-night television show. That's wild.
It is.
Who actually watched the episode and became the necessary expert? Who stepped in?
That was a biochemist named William Sly, who worked at St. Louis University. He saw the story, and his expertise immediately recognized the potential for a medical or metabolic explanation that had been completely overlooked.
So he reached out.
He agreed to dedicate his resources to retesting Ryan's original blood samples that thankfully had been preserved.
Sly then brought those samples to his colleague, James Shoemaker, who was an MD and a PhD.
Right. He was the director of the metabolic screening lab at St. Louis University.
And Shoemaker.
Shoemaker immediately confirmed the diagnosis that the court had refused to consider relevant.
That Ryan had, in fact, suffered from methylmalonic acidemia.
Yes. The diagnosis for both children was identical. It proved this was a genetic tragedy, not a crime.
But proving the cause of death was unutterable. MMA didn't automatically erase the prosecution's central piece of evidence, right? They still had that report showing high levels of what was identified as ethylene glycol.
Exactly. That was the central mystery.
So since ethylene glycol is not naturally found in the body, the fundamental question for the scientists was, how did MMA get mistaken for antifreeze poisoning?
This is where the core scientific elegance and the forensic tragedy really emerges. It requires us to understand a little bit about chemistry and toxicology screening.
Okay.
Shoemaker knew the cause of death was MMA, but he needed to prove the original test was flawed. So he requested the specific methods that were used to measure ethylene glycol in Ryan's blood from prosecutor McElroy.
Let's pause there and really focus on the mechanism. The source material highlights that the molecule produced by MMA is propionic acid.
Right.
And that molecule and ethylene glycol, the suspected toxin, differ by only one single carbon atom. For the listener who isn't a chemist, why does that one atom difference matter so much? And how could a machine possibly confuse them?
It matters everything because it highlights the difference between a quick screening test and a definitive identification test.
Okay.
Many initial toxicology screens rely on a technique called gas chromatography, or GC. In GC, a sample is vaporized and travels through a long, thin column, and different compounds travel at different speeds.
And the time it takes for a substance to emerge, that's called the retention time, is used to identify it.
Exactly. And propionic acid is structurally very, very similar to ethylene glycol. They differ by only one carbon atom in their base chain.
So if the method used wasn't high resolution enough, the two compounds would travel through that column at such similar speeds
That the machine would register them as virtually identical.
it would confuse the naturally occurring propionic acid for the toxic ethylene glycol.
Precisely. Shoemaker determined that propionic acid, which was produced in abundance by Ryan because of his M&A, caused a result that, when using the routine testing method from the Stallings case, careless observers might mistake for ethylene glycol.
So it wasn't a malicious mistake.
No, it was a fundamental flaw in the chosen analytical method. It lacked the specificity, or you could say the resolving power, to distinguish between two chemically related compounds. It misinterpreted a C3 metabolite as a C2 toxin.
And to prove this wasn't just some hypothetical flaw, Shoemaker undertook a critical, scientifically rigorous experiment that truly forced the issue.
Yes, the validation study. This was brilliant. Shoemaker created samples of healthy blood and then spiked them with propion, the MMA metabolite.
The very substance in question.
The very one. He then sent these samples blinded to several commercial laboratories, instructing them to test the samples using the exact same method that the original lab had used on Ryan's blood.
And the results were just devastating evidence of a systemic failure.
Absolutely damning. The source material states that nearly half of those commercial laboratory tests came back with the incorrect conclusion.
They reported ethylene glycol poisoning.
They did. This scientifically proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the standard toxicology methodology, when confronted with blood from an MMA patient, was prone to producing a massive false positive for antifreeze. The prosecution's cornerstone evidence was scientifically invalidated.
And the scientific confirmation just kept pouring in after that.
It did. William Sly and James Shoemaker contacted Piero Rinaldo, a highly respected metabolic expert from Yale University, who then reviewed the complete data set.
And Rinaldo's confirmation was essential.
It was, because it established a consensus among the top experts in the field. He definitively concluded that Ryan died of MMA.
So it was this collective weight of evidence, Shoemaker's chemical proof of the methodology flaw, and Rinaldo's consensus diagnosis,
that finally forced prosecutor George McElroy to confront the scientific reality. The prosecutor was ultimately convinced that poisoning simply could not have occurred, and that led to the legal reversal.
This entire sequence just highlights the absolute necessity of verification and rigorous testing methods, even in what seem like straightforward toxicology cases.
It does.
When science and justice intersect, forensic certainty has to be paramount. The failure to confirm the chemical identity using high-resolution methods, especially when they knew MMA was a possibility, created the perfect storm for a wrongful conviction.
And that failure occurred on three fronts. The medical failure to properly test for MMA when it was initially considered, the forensic failure to use sufficiently specific testing methods, and the legal failure to admit evidence of a genetic tendency from the sibling.
Following this conclusive scientific reversal, the system finally moved to correct the error. In July 1991, Stallings was released from jail pending a new trial.
Though she was placed under house arrest.
Right. But this ended her nearly 2 years of incarceration for a crime that literally never happened.
And the full exoneration followed quickly. In September 1991, the prosecutors formally apologized to Patricia Stallings and, critically, dropped the case against her entirely.
The first-degree murder charge was dismissed.
She was a free woman, proven innocent by genetic and chemical evidence.
But after her release, the personal trauma and the long-term legal fallout for Patricia Stallings just continued. Exoneration is not the end of the story.
No, it's the beginning of dealing with the consequences of that kind of institutional failure.
The personal impact was immediate and harrowing. Stallings reported that she lost a significant amount of weight just from the severe stress of being imprisoned and facing a murder conviction.
And she credited her strong Buddhist faith with providing the necessary internal strength and resilience to survive that ordeal. It's a powerful testament to finding internal coping mechanisms when external systems fail you so catastrophically.
She also provided a really insightful view on public perception, which is so often shaped by media narratives. Stallings mentioned that the negative public view of her situation may have been strongly influenced by the high-profile case of Paula Sims, which was dominating headlines around the same time.
And Sims was a mother convicted of killing her 2 daughters.
Right, which contributed to this toxic atmosphere of suspicion around mothers whose children died under mysterious circumstances.
That contextual detail is just crucial. It shows how the presumption of innocence can be overridden by prevailing cultural anxieties and unrelated legal cases, making it harder for the public and maybe even the jury to accept the possibility of a natural, non-criminal tragedy.
In terms of seeking financial and legal rectification, Stallings took some very important steps.
She did.
In 1993, she successfully sued the institutions whose errors led to her conviction, specifically Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital and the laboratory that performed the initial flawed blood test.
And this civil suit was vital. She won a seven-figure settlement in an out-of-court agreement.
And while no amount of money can truly compensate for the loss of a child and 2 years of your life and liberty,
Right.
the settlement was a concrete admission of fault from the medical and scientific entities involved. It holds them financially accountable for the diagnostic errors that were the root cause of this entire legal disaster. And beyond the financial settlement, Stallings took political action, which really underscores her desire for accountability within the justice system itself.
She targeted the prosecutor who had fought so hard to maintain her conviction and exclude the evidence, George McElroy.
That's right. When McElroy ran for re-election as Jefferson County prosecutor in 1994, Stallings donated a substantial $10,000 to his opponent, Robert Wilkins.
Wow. That donation just speaks volumes. It wasn't just about financial compensation. It was about ensuring that the person responsible for ignoring the evidence of her innocence was removed from a position of immense power.
And Wilkins won the election, which demonstrates that the community recognized the seriousness of the systemic failure in her case.
They did.
However, even after the civil success and the political victory, achieving a completely clean slate proved incredibly difficult.
This is a common problem.
When McElroy offered to share his information on the Stallings case with Wilkins, the new prosecutor, Stallings went to court to have her arrest record expunged, that is, legally erased.
And this highlights one of the most persistent and frustrating consequences of a wrongful accusation: the long-term shadow of a felony arrest.
It never really goes away.
While the court ordered some of the information expunged, a judge noted that Missouri law mandated that prosecutors confidentially maintain some information related to felony arrests, even those that result in exoneration.
So even with a formal apology and dropped charges, the administrative paper trail of the initial accusation persists indefinitely in some form.
Absolutely. Exoneration clears your name publicly and legally, but the fact that a prosecutor is legally obligated to maintain records related to a felony arrest means that data point, that initial suspicion, never completely disappears from the system.
And for the wrongfully accused, this can continue to impact everything from employment background checks to civil rights for decades.
It shows that the legal system is far better at accusing than it is at fully erasing the memory of that accusation.
And the family tragedy was compounded years later. Her second son, David Jr., or DJ.
The very one whose illness had provided the definitive evidence to save his mother.
He died in 2013 at the age of 23.
That's just a terrible continuation of the tragedy. It reminds us that the genetic disorder, the MMA, was a persistent and life-threatening medical reality for the family, separate and apart from the legal ordeal. Despite his diagnosis saving his mother, the condition ultimately claimed his life years later.
Patricia and David Stallings divorced in the 1990s, which is sadly understandable given the unimaginable stress, the public scrutiny, and the legal battles they endured.
David Sr. later died in 2019 at the age of 57. The case left an indelible trail of personal destruction and continuing loss for the entire family.
But institutionally, the case did create a lasting, positive legacy.
It did. The Stallings case is now widely cited in scientific literature, including foundational high-level texts like Leningy Principles of Biochemistry.
So it's transformed from a court record of failure into a scientific reference point.
It serves as the ultimate cautionary tale.
A cautionary example of a metabolic disorder that so perfectly mimics a criminal act.
And it's used to instruct current and future medical students, biochemists, and forensic scientists about the absolute necessity of chemical specificity in testing.
And the potentially fatal consequences of misidentifying a naturally occurring metabolite as a toxin. The injustice led directly to improved testing protocols in labs across the country. This entire story, then, is fundamentally about the limits of initial scientific certainty and the immense responsibility of the courtroom when interpreting specialized knowledge.
It is.
We've covered a massive amount of technical and legal detail, so let's try to synthesize these core knowledge nuggets for you.
I think the material provided yields 4 essential points of understanding that really summarize this complex tragedy and the institutional lessons that were learned.
Okay, first, we see the dangerous speed of the immediate leap from observing a suspected toxic substance, that initial finding of what was thought to be ethylene glycol, to the assumption of criminal intent.
This confirmation bias meant the legal and medical systems stopped searching for natural causes the moment the word antifreeze was introduced.
Second, the core failure was rooted in a critical, microscopic scientific nuance.
It was. The cause was the rare genetic disorder, MMA, which produces propionic acid. That specific molecule differs from the presumed toxin, ethylene glycol, by only a single carbon atom.
And this minor chemical difference caused massive diagnostic confusion because the initial toxicology method lacked the specificity to distinguish between a C3 metabolite and a C2 toxin.
And third, we have to recognize the failure of the justice system's rigidity. The court actively refused to admit highly relevant exculpatory evidence based on the definitive diagnosis of the sibling, David Jr.
And this failure forced Patricia Stallings to rely on outside intervention, a television program, and independent academic scientists like Sly and Shoemaker, to correct a grave error that the formal legal system could not or would not fix internally.
And fourth, this case underscores the vital importance of verification and rigorous testing methods in all forensic science. Shoemaker's validation experiment, where he proved the commercial labs failed nearly half the time when testing that propionate-spiked blood, was the ultimate proof. It demonstrated that what the prosecution presented as definitive scientific proof was, in fact, scientifically flawed methodology,
forcing a much-needed reevaluation of standard toxicology screening protocols in criminal cases.
It did.
What's fascinating is that the medical knowledge, the possibility of MMA, was known by the physicians involved in Ryan's initial care, as evidenced by the prosecutor's own notes.
But the system moved too quickly toward certainty. It became fixed on that initial toxicological result and then became too rigid to accept new information, even when it was supported by the parallel diagnosis of a second child.
So if we connect this to the broader picture,
it tells us that scientific evidence in the courtroom, even when it's presented as objective fact, is only as reliable as the methodology used and the willingness of the legal system to challenge its own assumptions.
when human biochemistry presents subtleties and complications, as it did here,
The legal system must proceed with immense caution. The law demands black and white, guilty or innocent, but human physiology often operates in shades of gray.
it's a sobering realization about how easily and catastrophically these institutional errors can compound. To close this discussion, we must leave you with the question that the material compels us all to confront. Given the high potential for diagnostic errors in complex metabolic disorders, as dramatically demonstrated by the Stallings case, what precise level of scientific proof and what degree of methodological verification should the legal system mandate before allowing a life sentence verdict based primarily or exclusively on complex toxicology reports? Thanks for listening. We appreciate you exploring this challenging material with us.